Under the frost-kissed veil of the midnight moon, a single snowflake fell, like a forgotten tear upon the throne of shattered oaths. Isella Morwen's breath hung in the frozen air of the great hall, a fragile mist that curled like smoke from a dying fire. The year had turned once before, in the clamor of that fateful New Year's Eve, when the ritual of mating had bound the pack in joyous frenzy, or so they believed. But for her, it had been the unraveling. She remembered the weight of their eyes, the alphas of the court, their laughter sharp as splintered ice, echoing off the vaulted ceilings of the lunar citadel. She had been 26 then, her omega essence blooming like wild heather under a summer sky, offered in the sacred circle where fates intertwined under the goddess's gaze. Yet Thorn Blackwood, the Alpha King himself, had turned away. His rejection was not a whisper, but a decree, proclaimed before the assembled packs. "Unworthy," he had growled, his voice laced with the cold authority of one who bore the crown's thorns. The hall had erupted in mockery, the scent of her humiliation mingling with the incense of pine and blood wine as she was cast out into the winter wilds. Exile had claimed her swiftly. Banished to the shadowed fringes of the Frostfang Mountains, where the wind howled like the spirits of the forsaken, Isella had wandered the snow-swept paths alone. The cold seeped into her bones, a relentless companion that mirrored the ache in her chest. No pack to shelter her, no fire to warm the chill of betrayal. She had survived on the scraps of her wits and the faint pulse of her inner light, that omega resilience the alphas so often dismissed as weakness. The mountains were unforgiving, jagged peaks clawing at the heavens, forests of ancient pines bowed under eternal white, and caves that whispered secrets in the echo of dripping ice. Here, the moon reigned supreme, her silver light filtering through crystalline branches, painting the world in hues of blue and silver. Isella's only solace was the small amulet she clutched, a silver crescent moon etched with runes from her mother's line, warm against her skin despite the frost. It had been her grandmother's, a relic of the old queens, passed down in secrecy amid whispers of a forgotten heritage. Days blurred into nights as she foraged for roots buried under the snow, her bare feet numbed against the frozen earth. The wind carried distant weevos, warnings from the wild wolves that roamed the borders, their cries a lament for the lost. Hunger gnawed at her, but it was the solitude that carved deepest. In the quiet hours, when the stars wheeled overhead like indifferent judges, Isella questioned the goddess's design. Why mark her for rejection, if not for some greater unraveling? The Alpha's scorn had stripped her bare, leaving only the raw truth of her spirit. She dreamed of the citadel's hearths, the roar of flames in the grand fireplace, the metallic tang of blood from the ritual feasts. But those memories soured now, tainted by Thorn's golden eyes, eyes that had once held promise, now hardened by duty and doubt. One storm-lashed evening, as the blizzard raged like the fury of betrayed gods, Isella sought refuge in a cavern, half buried in the mountainside. The entrance was a maw of ice and stone, guarded by icicles like frozen spears. Inside, the air was still, heavy with the mineral scent of earth and damp. She kindled a small fire with flint struck from her amulet's chain, the flames dancing tentatively, casting shadows that flickered like ghosts on the walls. Her body trembled as she huddled close, the heat a fleeting mercy against the encroaching cold. In that fragile glow, she traced the runes on the crescent, their lines glowing faintly under her touch, a secret she had only begun to decipher in her isolation. Whispers from childhood tales resurfaced, the Morwen bloodline, tied to the lunar throne through veins of ancient power, diluted by centuries of scheming alphas who had seized control through betrayal. The storm outside intensified, thunder rumbling like the growl of an awakening beast. Isella's heart quickened, not from fear, but from an instinctive pull, a thread tugging at her core, omega senses stirring amid the isolation. She rose, peering into the swirling white beyond the cave's lip. Through the veil of snow, a shape emerged. A lone figure staggering against the gale, cloaked in furs matted with ice, his form broad yet bowed by exhaustion. He collapsed just inside the entrance, breath ragged, the scent of blood and alpha musk cutting through the storm's chill. Thorn Blackwood. The king himself, wounded, his armor rent by what looked like claw marks, fresh and savage. His eyes, those piercing gold, met hers in the firelight. Shock, recognition, and something deeper, a flicker of the guilt he had buried under his crown. She froze, the amulet burning hot in her palm. Instinct screamed to flee, to let the cold claim him as it had nearly claimed her. But curiosity, laced with the bitter curiosity of the rejected, held her fast. He was no conqueror here, but a shadow of the alpha who had cast her aside. Blood trickled from a gash on his brow, staining the snow red, and in that moment, under the moon's unyielding watch, the wind seemed to hush, as if the goddess herself leaned in to witness the thread of fate beginning to weave. Isella stepped forward, her voice a whisper lost in the ember's crackle. What storm has brought the king to my exile? His gaze held hers, weary and haunted, the weight of unspoken regrets hanging between them like the frost on the cave walls. The fire popped, sending sparks upward, and for the first time in a year, the cold felt less absolute. Thorn's breath came in labored bursts, each one stirring the embers into faint life, as if the fire itself recoiled from the intrusion of his presence. Isella's pulse thrummed against the amulet's chain, the silver crescent warming like a brand against her skin, its runes pulsing with an inner light she dared not acknowledge. Fear coiled in her gut, sharp as the icicles outside, mingling with a treacherous curiosity that pulled her closer despite the chasm of his betrayal. He was no longer the untouchable king, enthroned in gold and shadow. Here, he was a broken silhouette, his broad frame slumped against the cavern wall, furs sodden and torn, revealing gashes that wept crimson into the snow-dusted stone. The scent of his blood, metallic, primal, overpowered the cave's damp earthiness, awakening something deep within her, an omega instinct she had long suppressed. She knelt at a distance, the rough ground biting through her threadbare cloak, her eyes tracing the furrow of pain across his brow. Those golden eyes, once so commanding, now flickered with exhaustion and a raw vulnerability that mirrored her own hidden fractures. "Speak," she demanded, her voice steadier than she felt, laced with the edge of one who had learned survival in silence. "Or shall I leave you to the storm's mercy, as you left me to winter's?" He winced, pressing a gauntleted hand to his side where blood seeped through rent leather, the metallic tang sharpening the air. "Isella!" he rasped, her name a gravelly exhale that hung between them like frost on breath. Recognition dawned in his gaze, deepening the shadows of guilt that etched his features. "The goddess mocks us both." He shifted, grimacing, and a low growl escaped him, not of threat, but of the beast within warring against its wounds. Outside, the wind howled anew, whipping snow through the entrance in vengeful gusts, as if the mountains themselves conspired to seal them in this uneasy truce. She should have turned away. The memory of that New Year's Eve burned fresh. His rejection, the court's jeers like knives in the dim torchlight of the citadel, her spirit laid bare and discarded. Yet here he was, felled by some unseen foe, his alpha strength reduced to tremors. Curiosity won, a fragile bridge over the abyss of her resentment. She edged nearer, tearing a strip from her cloak to press against his deepest gash. The contact sent a jolt through her, his skin fever-hot beneath the cold, the instinctive pull of their natures clashing like thunder in her veins. Denied, she told herself. This was no bond, only the echo of what might have been, twisted by fate's cruel hand. "The assassins," he murmured, his voice threading through the crackle of flames as she worked. "From the rival packs. They struck in the passes, shadows under the moon's blind eye. His eyes met hers again, holding a depth of sorrow that pierced her defenses. I did not know, the weight of my choice until the crown's thorns drew my own blood. Guilt laced his words, heavy as the snow's burden on ancient pines, but Isela felt no pity, only the stir of questions she had buried in her exile. Why him? Why now, when her solitude had forged her into something sharper, less breakable? The storm raged on, sealing the cave's mouth with drifts of white, trapping them in a world of flickering firelight and unspoken accusations. She built the flames higher, feeding them twisted roots scavenged from her meager stores, the heat blooming like a hesitant dawn against the chill. Thorn watched her, his breaths evening as the bleeding slowed, but tension coiled in his frame, a predator assessing an unlikely ally. "You survive here," he said softly, wonder threading his tone. "Where I falter. The wilds should have claimed you." "Claimed?" She laughed, a bitter sound swallowed by the cavern's echo. "Exile is not death, King. It is rebirth in the goddess's forge." Her fingers brushed the amulet unconsciously, its warmth a secret anchor amid the turmoil. The runes seemed to hum, faint as a distant weevo, responding to the Alpha's proximity, or perhaps to the blood now staining her hands, mingling with the fire's glow in droplets of deep red. Blood, fire, moon, symbols weaving through her thoughts like threads of an unraveling tapestry, hinting at destinies long obscured. As the night deepened, the wind's fury softened to mournful whispers, and an uneasy refuge settled over them. Isela retreated to her side of the fire, the divide marked by shadows dancing on the walls like wary spirits. He spoke haltingly of the court's intrigues, the betrayals festering beneath the citadel's spires, Alphas scheming for the throne's gilded poison. His voice, once a decree, now carried the melancholy of one burdened by duty's chains, each word a confession veiled in weariness. She listened, her heart a battlefield of fear and reluctant empathy, the instinctive draw of their connection flickering like the embers between them. Denied, yet undeniable, born of curiosity's spark amid the fear of what this encounter might unearth. In the fire's dying light, as Thorn's eyes drifted to uneasy sleep, Isela gazed at the cave's ceiling, where moonlight pierced a crack like a silver blade. The amulet cooled against her chest, but the pull remained, a thread of fate, tenuous and fraught, binding the rejected to the remorseful under the goddess's watchful gaze. What strength lay in this fragile shelter, if not the choice to withhold mercy or extend it? The question lingered, heavy as the snow outside, as the first hints of dawn bled gray into the storm. And now I invite you to leave a trace of your presence in the comments. Tell us where in the world you're watching from and the exact hour you hear this story. We wish to know how far these northern confessions travel and at what moments of the night they find you. Dawn's pale fingers clawed through the cavern's narrow fissure, spilling a hesitant light over the embers that had guarded their night. Isela stirred, her body stiff from the unyielding stone, the chill seeping back like an old wound reopened. Across the dying fire, Thorn lay still, his chest rising in shallow rhythms, the makeshift bandage on his side darkened with dried blood. The air hung heavy with the scent of smoke and iron, a fragile peace woven from necessity rather than trust. She watched him, the Alpha King reduced to this, vulnerable, marked by gashes that spoke of battles beyond the court's gilded intrigues. Resentment flickered in her chest, a spark against the empathy she refused to name, but the amulet's weight against her heart reminded her of deeper currents, runes humming faintly as if attuned to his labored breaths. She rose quietly, slipping to the cave's mouth where the storm had relented, leaving a world blanketed in pristine white, the frost-fang peaks standing sentinel under a sky bruised with lingering clouds. The wind whispered now, carrying the faint, acrid tang of pursuit, smoke from distant torches, perhaps, or the musk of wolves on the hunt. Her omega senses sharpened, a prickle along her spine, urging vigilance. Exile had taught her to read the wilds like a forbidden scroll, the crunch of snow under boot, the subtle shift in air before danger broke. She gathered what she could, twisted branches for the fire, a handful of frostbitten berries from a hidden crevice, her movements deliberate, a ritual of survival that no longer felt like defeat. Thorn stirred as she returned, his golden eyes opening to slits, shadowed by pain but alert. "The storm passes," he murmured, voice rough as gravel underfoot, pushing himself upright with a grimace that pulled at his wounds. Blood flecked his lips, a stark red against pale skin, and Isella's hand tightened on the amulet, its silver cool now, as if withholding judgment. He was no longer the distant sovereign who had shattered her in the ritual's glare. Here, in the cavern's intimacy, he was a man forged in the same fire of duty and loss, his broad shoulders bowed not just by injury, but by the invisible chains of a crown stained with regret. "We cannot linger," she said, her tone edged with the authority of one who had claimed these mountains as her own. "The passes echo with your enemies' steps. I hear them in the wind, rival alphas, shadows slinking under the moon's veil." She knelt to stoke the flames, the heat blooming against her palms like a hesitant promise, casting his face in flickering gold. Curiosity had drawn her close last night, but now fear laced it, a shared peril that bound them tighter than any oath. The assassins he spoke of, loyal to the scheming betas who coveted the throne, would scent his blood like hounds, and an omega alone in their path was no sanctuary, only prey. He nodded, wincing as he tested his strength, the leather of his armor creaking like old bones. "They track me since the betrayal in the Citadel's undercroft. A poisoned blade meant for me struck true in the shadows." His gaze met hers, holding a depth that stirred the air between them, guilt threading through like smoke. "I rejected you to shield the pack from whispers of weakness, an omega tie that might unravel alliances. But the goddess twists our choices into thorns." The confession hung, raw and unadorned, and Isella felt the pull again, instinctive, a warmth uncoiling in her core despite the frost. Denied by his decree, yet here it bloomed in the refuge's confines, born of mutual desperation. The day wore on in tense vigil, the sun a distant ghost behind the clouds, painting the snow in muted silvers. They shared her meager stores, the berries tart on the tongue, their silence broken by halting words, his tales of courtly venom, the alphas who mocked her now circling like vultures for his fall. Her guarded stories of the wilds, the amulet's secrets glimpsed in starlit solitude. Empathy crept in, unbidden, as she changed his bandages, her fingers brushing skin fevered with infection's edge. His touch, when he steadied her hand, was gentle, a contrast to the king's iron command, sending a shiver through her that had nothing to do with cold. The cave became their bastion, walls echoing with the rhythm of their breaths, the fire's crackle a barrier against the world outside. As twilight bled into the sky, painting the peaks in deep indigos, the threat materialized. Distant weavos pierced the dusk, 3, maybe 4, closing in with predatory precision. Thorn tensed, his alpha instincts surging despite the pain, a low growl rumbling from his chest. "They come," he said, rising unsteadily, drawing a dagger from his boot, its blade etched with lunar runes that gleamed like the amulet's kin. Isella's heart pounded, the silver crescent burning hot now, as if awakening to the fray. Fear clawed at her, but so did resolve. Exile had honed her not to flee, but to stand. She grabbed a jagged branch, its end charred from the fire, a makeshift weapon in her grip. Together, they retreated deeper into the cavern, where side tunnels branched like veins in stone, the air growing colder, laced with the mineral bite of underground streams. The weavos grew nearer, boots crunching snow at the entrance, voices murmuring in guttural tones, rival pack scouts, their scents invading like poison. "The king's trail ends here," one snarled, the words echoing off ice. Thorn pulled her into a shadowed alcove, his body shielding hers, the heat of him a bulwark against the chill. His breath ghosted her ear, steadying her racing pulse. "Stay silent," he whispered, his hand on her arm a anchor, the contact igniting that denied bond into something fierce, protective. They waited, hearts sinking in the dark, as the intruders prowled, torches flaring orange against the walls, casting monstrous shadows. One ventured close, his form hulking, eyes gleaming with feral hunger. Thorn lunged, silent as a specter, his dagger finding the assassin's throat in a spray of blood that warmed the stone like spilled wine. The body slumped, but the alarm rose, curses, the clash of steel. Isella moved then, her branch swinging with the wild's fury, cracking against another's knee as he rounded the bend. Pain lanced her side from a glancing claw, hot and sharp, but she pressed on, the amulet's light pulsing faintly, guiding her strikes. Thorn fought beside her, a whirlwind of restrained power, his wounds reopening in crimson rivulets that mingled with the fallen's. Together, they drove the assailants back, the cavern a melee of grunts and the wet thud of flesh, firelight from drop torches illuminating the chaos in visceral strokes, red on white snow, gold eyes flashing defiance. The last fled into the night, weavos fading into the wind's lament, leaving the air thick with blood's coppery reek. Isella sagged against the wall, breath ragged, her wound a throbbing echo of survival. Thorn steadied her, his touch lingering, empathy forging into bond as their eyes met in the torch's glow. "You fought as kin?" he said softly, voice laced with wonder and the melancholy of what they had become. Protectors in exile's forge, the rejected and the remorseful united against the storm. The moon rose then, her silver gaze piercing the cavern like a benediction, bathing them in light that turned blood to rubies and wounds to scars of shared rebirth. In that moment, the divide narrowed, curiosity yielding to a tentative trust, the amulet's runes shimmering as if the goddess approved. Yet doubt lingered in Isella's heart. What mercy was this, extended to the one who had broken her? The question burned, a philosophical ember amid the refuge's fragile warmth, as they bandaged each other under the lunar watch, the wilds outside whispering of trials yet to come. The moon's silver sickle hung low over the frost-fang peaks, casting elongated shadows that stretched like accusing fingers across the cavern floor. Isella's wound throbbed with each heartbeat, a hot pulse beneath the hasty bandage Thorn had tied, the fabric stiffening with her own blood's slow seep. The air reeked of iron and singed fur, the remnants of their desperate clash clinging to the stone like a shroud. She leaned against the wall, her breath shallow, watching as Thorn extinguished the intruders' abandoned torches one by one, their flames hissing into silence under his boot. His movements were deliberate, shadowed by the pain etching deeper lines into his face, but his golden eyes held a new intensity. Gratitude laced with something sharper, an awakening awareness that unsettled her more than the assassin's howls still echoing in her ears. She clutched the amulet, its crescent form now feverish against her palm, the runes etched into its surface, glowing with an inner luminescence that hadn't faded since the fight's frenzy. It had guided her strikes, a subtle pull like moonlight on water, sharpening her senses amid the chaos. Exile had whispered of such things in her solitary nights, legends of the Morwen line, omegas who bore the goddess's sight, pathfinders who unraveled hidden truths under the lunar veil. But she had dismissed them as echoes of a shattered past, comforts for the rejected. Now, as the adrenaline ebbed, leaving her trembling in the cold's resurgence, doubt gnawed. Was this warmth merely fever, or the stir of a power long dormant? Thorn knelt before her, his hands steady despite the fresh crimson staining his armor. He unwound the bandage on her side, exposing the claw's ragged mark, the skin around it inflamed like embers banked in ash. His touch was feather-light, tracing the edges with a healer's caution, but the contact ignited a spark, instinctive, undeniable, threading through her veins like warmed wine. "This mark will scar," he murmured, his voice a low rumble that vibrated against the cavern's hush. "But it suits you. A warrior's badge, earned in blood beside a fool king." Guilt shadowed his words, the melancholy of his crown's burdens surfacing again. Yet there was no plea in his gaze, only the raw honesty of one who had glimpsed redemption's fragile edge. Isella pulled away slightly, the amulet slipping from her grasp to dangle between them, its light pulsing in rhythm with her pulse. "Fool or king, you brought this storm upon us," she replied, her tone laced with the tragic bite of their shared exile, though empathy softened its edge. The wind outside moaned softly, carrying the faint scent of pine and distant smoke, a reminder that their refuge was temporary, the wild's vast indifference closing in. She had fought for him, not out of lingering affection, but from the visceral pull of survival, the omega fire that burned brighter in adversity. Yet as his fingers brushed the amulet's chain, a jolt coursed through her, sharp as lightning fracturing ice. The runes ignited fully then, bathing the alcove in ethereal silver, the light coiling like mist from a sacred spring. Visions assailed her, unbidden and vivid. The lunar citadel, not as she remembered it in humiliation, but in its ancient glory. Towers of crystalline ice rising under a perpetual full moon, queens of the Morwen bloodline enthroned in robes woven from starlight, their Pathfinder gifts unveiling betrayals that toppled false alphas. She saw Thorn's lineage intertwined, not as conquerors, but as guardians sworn to protect the true heirs, a pact sealed in blood under the goddess's gaze. Documents flashed in her mind's eye, sealed scrolls hidden in the mountain's forgotten archives, bearing her grandmother's seal, proclaiming the throne's theft through centuries of scheming. Her rejection, the court's mockery, it was no accident, but a desperate veil to bury the truth of her claim. Isella gasped, the visions receding like tide from shore, leaving her breathless, the amulet cooling in her hand. Thorn stared, transfixed, his golden eyes widening as the light reflected in their depths, mirroring the revelation's weight. "What sorcery is this?" he whispered, his voice threaded with awe and the dawning horror of realization. He reached out, hesitating, then cupped the amulet gently, as if it might shatter under his touch. The contact amplified the echo in her soul, a key turning in a lock, long rusted. The runes. They speak of the old oaths. Morwen, the Pathfinder's mark. His breath caught, the Alpha's stoic mask cracking, revealing the ethical torment beneath. Duty's chains now binding him to a truth that upended his reign. She met his gaze, the cave's chill forgotten in the heat of disclosure, her heart a storm of fear and fierce clarity. The gift had manifested not in isolation, but in their union's crucible, her hidden power, the goddess's revelation, positioning her as the rightful heir, the one to reclaim the throne from the Alphas who had laughed at her fall. Thorn's guilt deepened, visible in the furrow of his brow, the way his hand trembled against hers. "I rejected you to preserve a lie," he confessed, voice breaking like frost underfoot. "To shield the pack from rivals who would exploit any weakness. But you are the key, the bloodline's true vessel, the one to restore what was stolen." Melancholy infused his words, the romantic tragedy of their fates intertwining, love as proof, not prize, demanding he yield power to the Omega he had wronged. The wind howled anew, rattling loose stones like distant thunder, as if the mountains bore witness to this spiritual unveiling. Isella felt the weight of it, the rebirth stirring in her veins, blood singing with lunar fire, yet the dilemma clawed at her spirit. To embrace this destiny meant confronting the court, forcing knees to bend in ancestral judgment, but at what cost to her hard-won solitude? Mercy or retribution? Was strength in crowning the fallen, or in shattering the throne that had scarred her? Thorn's eyes held hers, a silent vow forming in the silver glow, the bond resisting no longer, rationalized into acceptance amid the revelation's blaze. The moon watched impassively, her light filtering through cracks like threads of inevitable fate as the rejected Omega glimpsed her path to justice, the king's remorse forging the first link in redemption's chain. Subscribe if you believe mercy can crown even the fallen. Comment Luna if you'd walk through the storm for someone who saw your. The cavern's silver glow faded as the amulet slipped from Thorn's grasp, leaving only the moon's cold scrutiny piercing the cracks above. Isella's skin prickled with the aftershock of revelation, her blood humming like a distant river thawed under spring's reluctant touch. The visions lingered in her mind's corners, crystalline towers of the lunar citadel, queens of old wielding pathfinder sight to expose the rot of false crowns, their justice a blade forged in lunar fire. She was no longer the exiled Omega, adrift in winter's maw. She was the vessel, the key to unravel the throne's stolen legacy. Yet the weight of it crushed her breath, a moral tempest swirling. To reclaim what was hers meant dragging the past's shadows into the light, forcing knees to bend in ancestral decree. Forgiveness or the sweet sting of war? Love's proof demanded she choose, not as victim, but as sovereign reborn. Thorn rose slowly, his wounds a map of crimson across his frame, the alpha's melancholy etching deeper furrows into his brow. His golden eyes, once thrones of command, now reflected her turmoil, guilt coiling like smoke from banked embers. "The citadel calls," he said, voice a gravelly vow laced with ethical torment. "New Year's Eve approaches, the packs gathering under the full moon's zenith. If the documents exist as your gift reveals, we must unearth them from the Undercroft archives, sealed by your bloodline's hand." He extended a hand, scarred and steady, the instinctive bond pulling taut between them, no longer denied, but tested in the forge of shared destiny. Isella hesitated, the wind outside rising to a mournful howl, carrying the scent of pine and impending snow. Freedom whispered in the wild's vast silence, a liberty hard-won in exile's chill. To follow him was to court the court's venom, the alpha's jeers reborn as daggers. She took his hand, the contact a spark against the cold stone of her resolve, warmth seeping through like fire through frost. "Not for you," she murmured, her tone tragic and resolute, "but for the goddess's weave. The Morwen claim demands reckoning." They gathered what remained, his dagger, her amulet, strips of fur for the journey, and slipped into the night, the storm's remnants blanketing the peaks in fresh white, muffling their steps like a shroud. The frost fangs loomed, jagged sentinels under a sky bruised indigo, the moon's sickle sharpening as they descended twisting paths. Wind clawed at their cloaks, icy fingers tracing the scars of battle, while distant uivos echoed from the valleys below. Rival packs stirring, scents of blood and ambition threading the air. Days blurred in relentless march, the mountains yielding to forested slopes where ancient pines bowed under snow's burden, their branches whispering secrets in the gale. Isella's side ached with each stride, a visceral reminder of their refuge's cost. But the amulet guided her, its runes flickering like stars in fog, unveiling hidden trails that evaded patrols. Thorn walked beside her, his presence a bulwark against the cold, his confessions unfolding in quiet hours by makeshift fires, tales of the throne's theft, how his own line had allied with traitors centuries past, burying the Morwen scrolls to hoard power. "I was blind to the lie," he admitted one eve, as flames danced on his face, casting gold into the shadows of his guilt. Rejecting you was my shield for a rotting kingdom, but now you are its salvation, if mercy allows." His words hung, philosophical embers. What was strength if not yielding the crown to compassion's hand? Empathy had bloomed into bond, resisted no more, yet Isella felt the pull of liberty's call, the wild's freedom a siren against love's redemptive chain. As the citadel's spires pierced the horizon, towers of ice-veined stone gleaming under torchlight, the air thickened with the clamor of gathering packs. New Year's Eve descended, the full moon swelling like a judgment eye, bathing the world in silver that turned snow to diamonds and blood to rubies in memory. They approached under cover of dusk, cloaked in furs stolen from a forgotten outpost, the wind carrying the metallic tang of ritual feasts and the low growl of alphas asserting dominance. Thorn's contacts among the ancient guard, loyal shadows from his ethical core, met them at the outer walls, their faces weathered as old runes, eyes widening at Isella's presence. "The Pathfinder returns," one whispered, pressing a concealed key into her palm, its edge cold as betrayal's bite. The Undercroft lay beneath the great hall, a labyrinth of vaulted stone where torches sputtered in iron sconces, casting elongated shadows like specters of the past. Steps echoed softly as they descended, the air growing heavy with dust and the faint, sacred scent of aged parchment. Isella's heart thundered, the amulet burning against her chest, guiding her to a sealed alcove where moonlight slanted through a grate above, illuminating a chest bound in silver chains etched with Morwen crescents. Her fingers trembled as she traced the lock, blood from a pricked thumb awakening the mechanism with a hiss, the lid creaking open to reveal scrolls yellowed by time, seals intact, proclaiming her grandmother's lineage as true heirs, the throne's usurpation laid bare in ink and oath. But the confrontation came swift as a predator's lunge. Footsteps thundered from the shadows. Lord Varen, the rival alpha whose betas had loosed the assassins. His form hulking in torchlight, flanked by the court's mocking faces, the very alphas who had laughed at her rejection a year prior, their eyes gleaming with feral greed. "The fallen Omega and her pet king," Varen snarled, his voice a guttural rumble that chilled the air, claws extending as his pack closed in, the scent of bloodlust mingling with the Undercroft's must. Thorn stepped forward, dagger drawn, his growl a thunder of protective fury, but Isella raised a hand, the amulet flaring bright, visions assaulting her anew, Varen's betrayal, poisoned alliances forged in the ritual's very circle, his ambition the rot at the throne's heart. The pack lunged, a whirlwind of claws and snarls, steel clashing in the confined space, blood sprang hot across stone as Thorn felled two with savage precision, his wounds reopening in crimson arcs. Isella fought with Pathfinder's clarity, the amulet's light revealing weak points in the fray, a dodge here, a strike there. Her branch from the wilds replaced by a fallen torch, its flame whipping like lunar wrath. Pain bloomed anew, a claw raking her arm, but she pressed on, the moral crux crystallizing amid the chaos. Forgive these mockers, bind them in compassion's chain, or unleash the ancestral bond to force their knees, war's justice over love's fragile peace. Varen cornered her against the scrolls, his breath hot and reeking of bloodwine, golden eyes mocking as in that fateful eve. "Kneel to your betters, whelp," he hissed, but Isella's gaze held steady, the moon's beam crowning her in silver, the amulet's power surging like a tidal wave. She invoked the runes, voice steady as winter's core. "By Morwen blood and goddess's decree, yield to the true heir." The air thickened, an invisible force rippling outward, ancestral bonds awakening. Varen staggered, compelled to his knees, his pack following in a cascade of growls turning to whimpers, the traitor's face twisting in horrified realization. Thorn reached her side, bloodied but unbowed, his hand on her shoulder a anchor of remorseful alliance. The Undercroft fell silent, save for ragged breaths and the distant revelry above, the full moon at zenith, midnight tolling like fate's hammer. Isella stood amid the kneeling foes, scrolls in hand, the dilemma searing her soul. Freedom in walking away, or the redemptive crown, demanding she forgive or wage war eternal. The choice loomed, ethical and spiritual, a philosophical blaze under the lunar gaze. What mercy crowned the fallen when power begged for vengeance? The wind above howled through the grate, carrying the pack's distant cheers, oblivious to the judgment unfolding below. As Isella's heart wrestled the throne's thorns, rebirth's fire kindling in the blood-streaked shadows. The Undercroft's shadows clung like reluctant ghosts to the kneeling forms, the air thick with the metallic bite of spilled blood and the acrid tang of fear sweat from alphas once so sure in their scorn. Isella's arm throbbed where the claw had torn flesh, a hot rivulet tracing her skin beneath the torn cloak. But the pain was distant now, overshadowed by the seismic tremor in her soul. The scrolls lay unfurled at her feet, their ancient ink a map of stolen thrones, proclaiming her Morwen blood as the unyielding vein of true power. Varen's hulking frame trembled before her, his golden eyes wide with the horror of ancestral compulsion. The bond's invisible chains coiling around his throat like frost-laced vines. The other alphas, those who had jeered at her rejection under the previous New Year's moon, their laughter ablaze in the ritual's incense-laden haze, mirrored his submission, heads bowed, the weight of the goddess's decree pressing them earthward. No longer mockers, but supplicants ensnared by the very hierarchy they had twisted. Thorn stood at her flank, his breath ragged, the fresh wounds on his chest seeping crimson through his rent armor, staining the stone in dark blooms that caught the moonlight's silver edge. His hand lingered on her shoulder, a steadying warmth that warred with the chill of the vaulted depths. His golden gaze locked on her face, remorse etched deep, the melancholy of a king unmade by truth. "The judgment falls," he murmured, voice a low thunder laced with ethical fracture. "But the choice is yours alone, Pathfinder. Mercy or the blade, redemption demands you weigh the pack's rot against your heart's fire." His touch ignited that bond anew, no longer resisted but a tether pulling her toward union, yet laced with the tragedy of what it cost. His crown yielded, her exile's solitude shattered. Isella's fingers tightened around the amulet, its crescent form pulsing like a second heartbeat. The runes alive with lunar fire that illuminated the scene in ethereal strokes. White stone veined with ice, red blood pooling like sacred offerings. The alpha's furred forms humbled in grays of steel and shadow. The wind above the grate howled in sympathy, carrying the muffled roar of the great hall's revelry. The packs toasting the turning year, oblivious to the Undercroft's unraveling. She stepped forward, the crunch of grit under her boots echoing like fate's inexorable step, her omega essence blooming fierce amid the alpha's submission. Varen lifted his head fractionally, defiance flickering in his eyes before the bond crushed it, his voice a guttural rasp. "The throne is ours by claw and conquest, whelp. Your blood's whisper changes nothing. Release us, or doom the realm to your weakness." The words struck like embers on dry tinder, igniting the embers of her humiliation. That New Year's Eve, the circle's flames leaping high as Thorn's rejection echoed, the court's alphas circling her like wolves scenting frailty, their mockery a chorus that had driven her into the wild's unforgiving arms. She had rebuilt there, in the Frostfang's frozen silence, learning the amulet's secrets through starlit vigils, her Pathfinder gift awakening not in isolation, but in this crucible of confrontation. Now, power thrummed in her veins, blood singing with the goddess's ancient song, freedom to walk away, leaving these traitors to their crumbling lies, or to invoke the full ancestral right, binding the pack eternally to her will, forcing knees to bend in historical justice. But love's proof loomed larger. Thorn's guilt, his ethical core demanding he atone not through war, but through yielding to compassion's crown. What was strength, if not choosing mercy over the vengeance that mirrored their sins? She knelt before Varan, the cold stone biting her knees, her free hand cupping his chin to force his gaze to hers. A mirror of the intimacy she had once craved in the ritual, now weaponized by rebirth. The alphas around them shifted uneasily, low growls rumbling like distant thunder, but the bond held, unyielding as the moon's pull. "You mocked the rejected," she whispered, her voice cadenced with tragic poetry, the wind's moan underscoring each word. "But the goddess weaves rejection into destiny's blade. The throne was never yours to hoard. It bleeds with the Morwen line's stolen fire." Visions flickered at the amulet's edge, flashes of Varan's treachery, poisoned chalices in council chambers, alliances forged in bloodwine's haze to bury her grandmother's claim, the very rejection of her avail to silence the Pathfinder's call. Empathy stirred unbidden, a reluctant bloom amid the pain. These alphas, broken by their own ambition, echoed her exile's despair, their power a hollow throne built on lies. Thorn's breath ghosted her ear as he knelt beside her, his presence a shield of shared scars, the scent of his blood mingling with hers in visceral unity. "Forgive and remake us," he urged softly, his hand covering hers on the amulet, the contact sending warmth cascading through her like fire through glacial veins. "War crowns no one. It only scars the soul deeper. I rejected you to preserve this poison. Let me stand as your guardian in its purge." His words carried the weight of his melancholy, the king's duty fracturing into love's redemptive plea, rationalized at last into acceptance. Not immediate passion, but a bond forged in moral fire, proof of their intertwined fates. The midnight bell tolled above, vibrating through the stone like the goddess's heartbeat, the full moon cresting zenith in a blaze of silver that flooded the undercroft, turning the kneeling alpha's eyes to molten gold. Isella rose, the amulet aloft, its light coiling outward like mist from a sacred pyre, enveloping the chamber in a web of lunar threads. The choice crystallized, ethical and spiritual. Power tempted with retribution's sweet release, forcing eternal kneel, shattering the rivals in ancestral fury, but compassion whispered of rebirth, a pack remade through forgiveness, her crown not of thorns, but of healed oaths. She invoked the rite's core, voice rising clear as a weevo under winter stars. "By blood and moon, I bind you not in chains, but in truth. Rise as kin, or fall to the lie's own shadow." The bond shifted, compulsion yielding to voluntary oath, Varan's form shuddering as clarity pierced his greed, the alphas murmuring allegiance, their mockery transmuted into awe. Yet doubt clawed at her spirit's edge, the wind's howl a philosophical lament. Had mercy crowned her, or merely delayed war's inevitable storm? Thorn pulled her close, his embrace a bulwark against the undercroft's chill, their hearts sinking in the moon's glow. Union's promise blooming tragic and tender amid the blood-slicked stone. The revelry above swelled, the new year dawning in cheers that masked the judgment below, as Isella felt the throne's thorns lighten, rebirth's fire kindling not in vengeance, but in the fragile light of chosen grace. The amulet cooled against her chest, a symbol of paths unveiled, but the final sacrifice loomed. Would love's proof demand her heart's full surrender, or liberty's wild call pull her back to the mountain's embrace? The question burned, a spiritual ember in the silvered dark, as the pack rose slowly, eyes reflecting her nascent reign, the goddess's gaze unblinking overhead. The undercroft's silvered hush shattered as the kneeling alphas rose, their forms unfolding like shadows released from lunar chains, eyes reflecting not defeat, but a dawning reverence that pierced Isella's guarded heart. The air thrummed with the aftermath's pulse, blood's coppery warmth pooling on flagstones. The wind's low moan through the grate above, carrying the great hall's oblivious revelry like a siren's distant call. Varen's broad shoulders straightened, his once snarling muzzle now bowed in true submission, the ancestral bond weaving through him like frost-etching glass, compelling not just knees, but souls to the Morwen truth. The other alphas followed, murmurs rippling through their ranks. The mockery of that fateful New Year's Eve transmuted into oaths whispered under the moon's zenith, their golden gazes fixed on her as if she were the flame they had long sought in the dark. Isella's breath caught, the amulet's crescent cool now against her chest, its runes dimming like embers after the blaze, a silent witness to the choice she had forged. Mercy had crowned her, not in vengeance's sharp release, but in this fragile union of wills, the pack's rot laid bare and cauterized by compassion's fire. Yet doubt lingered, a thorn in her spirit's flesh. Had she bound them truly, or merely veiled the war that simmered beneath their pledges? Thorn's arm encircled her waist, his touch a steady anchor amid the shifting tides, his wound's heat seeping through her cloak like a vow unspoken. His golden eyes met hers, melancholy yielding to quiet resolve, the king's ethical core alight with redemption's glow. "You have remade us," he murmured, voice a rumble soft as wind through pines. Not as conqueror, but as the pathfinder who sees the light in shadowed blood. The bond between them pulled taut. No longer resisted. Love as proof, accepted in the crucible of this night, demanding sacrifice, his throne for her healing, her exile's scars for the pack's rebirth. The ancient guard, faces etched with the loyalty of forgotten oaths, flanked them as they ascended the spiral stairs, torches flaring in sconces to cast elongated shadows that danced like liberated spirits. The great hall awaited above, its vaulted ceilings lost in gloom, pierced by moonlight streaming through arched windows, the full moon at her peak bathing the assembled packs in ethereal silver. Revelry reigned, alphas clashing goblets of blood wine, the air thick with the scent of roasted venison and pine incense, Weavos rising in joyous frenzy to greet the new year. But as Isella emerged, scrolls clutched in her bloodied hand, the amulet aloft like a beacon, silence fell, a wave crashing into stillness, the wind outside howling through the citadel's battlements as if the frostfangs themselves bore witness. Thorn stepped forward first, his voice booming like thunder over snow-swept peaks, cutting through the hush. The goddess unveils her decree. The Morwen heir returns, the throne's true blood awakened under the lunar fire. Gasps rippled through the hall, eyes widening as recognition dawned. The rejected Omega, marked by exile's frost, now radiant in the moon's embrace. Varen and his kin moved to the fore, their forms parting the crowd like a tide receding, faces grave with the weight of compelled truth. The midnight bell tolled once more, vibrating the chandeliers of ice-veined crystal, and Isella felt the ancestral bond surge, a visceral tide pulling at every alpha in the chamber. It began with Varen, his knees buckled, not in force, but in revelation's inexorable grace, hitting the marble floor with a resonant thud that echoed like fate's gavel. One by one they followed, the mockers of her ritual humiliation, those who had laughed as Thorn turned away, now compelled by blood's ancient call to kneel before the Pathfinder Queen. The hall filled with the soft thump of submission, golden eyes lowered, the air humming with the spiritual hush of justice restored, snowflakes drifting through open arches to settle on bowed heads like the goddess's benediction. Isella's heart swelled, a storm of emotion crashing through her, pain's echo from the wild's isolation, the amulet's warmth a counterpoint to the hall's chill, blood from her wounds mingling with the symbolic red of spilled wine on the floor. She mounted the dais, the throne of carved lunar stone waiting, its thorns dulled by centuries of false rule now yielding to her touch. Thorn knelt at her side, not as king, but as guardian, his hand finding hers in a union sealed by choice, sacrifice of power for love's redemptive cure, his guilt alchemized into devotion's quiet strength. "I yield the crown," he vowed, voice intimate amid the kneeling sea, for the pack's rebirth in your mercy's light. The bond completed its weave, empathy blooming into profound connection, resisted no more, romance tragic and tender, born of shared scars under the moon's unblinking eye. As the first chimes of the new year pealed, Isella placed the scrolls upon the throne, invoking the final rite. By blood, fire, and moon's eternal gaze, I claim what was stolen, not in war's shadow, but in compassion's flame. The amulet flared one last time, silver light cascading over the hall like a veil of starlit snow, binding the pack in oaths of fealty, Weavos rising not in challenge, but in harmonious rebirth. Varen lifted his head, eyes clear of greed, murmuring, "We kneel to the true sovereign, the rejected made royal." The Alphas echoed, their voices a chorus that shook the spires, the wind outside softening to a whisper, carrying the scent of fresh-fallen snow and pine's renewal. In that moment, under the moon's crowning arc, Isella felt the Renascimento complete. Exile's cold forge yielding to the warmth of destiny embraced, her Omega spirit no longer adrift, but enthroned in ethical grace. Thorn rose to stand beside her, their hands entwined, love's proof a quiet fire amid the hall's silvered splendor. Redemption not as reward, but as the soul's hard-won unveiling. The packs cheered, the new year dawning in unity's blaze, yet in her heart the philosophical ember glowed. What greater strength than mercy's crown, when vengeance's blade scarred the hand that wielded it? The goddess watched, her light fading into dawn's pale promise, as Isella Morwen, Pathfinder Queen, stepped into her reign. The amulet a symbol of paths forever changed, blood and fire yielding to the moon's redemptive peace. If your heart beat alongside ours, like, comment, and subscribe. Because every soul that joins our moon keeps the flame of redemption alive.